This is the second part of Chapter 6 in Mango's Mischief and Tales of Friendship, Stories from India by Chitrata Sandar, illustrated by Uma Krishnaswamy, and published by Candlewick Press. So we continue on page 126. He realized that the two boys had beaten him at his own challenge. Raja Apurva clapped his hands, and his guard brought a bag of gifts for the boys. "Well deserved," he said. "May you rule with wisdom always." A few weeks later, summer was nearing its end. The monsoon season was not far away. The winds had turned strong and cold. The visiting king was due to leave in a couple of days. As a farewell gesture, King Bhima invited his uncle to grace the royal court. Raja Apurva readily agreed. Prince Veera and Suku had been invited to attend too. Raja Apurva watched the proceedings with great interest. That afternoon, a poor man was brought before the king. "My name is Amkar, Your Highness," said the man. "I never learned a trade or a skill, and I didn't go to school. Now I'm unable to find a job that I can feed my family." King Bhima cleared his throat, but Raja Apurva spoke first. "Dear nephew Bhima," he said, "would you allow me to hear this case?" King Bhima hesitated for a moment and then nodded. "Of course," he said, "we would be delighted." Veera looked at Suku and mouthed, "This is not good." But what could he do? His father had to respect the wishes of his uncle. That was an unwritten rule for all nephews. Raja Apurva wasted no time. He addressed the poor man in front of him. "Dear man Amkar," he said, "what would you do to earn money for your family?" "Anything, Your Highness," said Amkar. "How about an unpleasant job? Nothing is more unpleasant for me than to listen to my baby crying with hunger." "Your Majesty," said Amkar, "I am prepared to do anything." "How do I know that you're not just saying that?" asked Raja Apurva. "I wish to test your words." "I'll do anything, Your Majesty," repeated Amkar. The man's suffering moved Veera and Suku. Families should not go hungry. Many times people had come asking for money, and King Bhima would send them to the stables or the kitchens or the garden to get work. Perhaps Raja Apurva would find the man a job that would provide him with a livelihood. Raja Apurva said, "This is what I want you to do. I want you to stand by the royal lake all night wearing nothing except your dhoti. The courtiers gasped. Summer was retreating. The night wind would be chilly and windy. But Amkar was desperate. He agreed to the king's test. "If you succeed," said Raja Apurva, "I will take you with me to my kingdom and give you a job in the palace." The court was dismissed in silence. Many people were worried for Amkar. Prince Veera and Suku knocked on King Bhima's door. "Father, this is unfair," said Veera. "You've got to do something about it." "We cannot interfere," said the king. "Bhima," Amkar agreed, "didn't he? If he had hesitated, I would have stepped in somehow." "Your father is right," said Suku. "You've got to let Amkar prove to the world that he would do anything for his family. But if he dies?" "The guards won't let that happen," said the king. "The royal doctor will be on hand." Prince Veera wasn't convinced, but his father and Suku were right. They had to let Amkar try and win his fight with the grand uncle, just as his father had let them count the crows. That night, the boys watched from the palace windows. Amkar arrived with no shirt and no coat. He was wearing just a tattered dhoti. He stood on the banks of the lake, watched by the two guards. The moon climbed to the sky, and the oil lamps in the corridors and rooms were blown out. The palace slowly went to sleep. Amkar was shivering in the cold, but he was determined to survive the night. He tried to distract himself by counting the columns on the palace corridors. Then he counted the fireflies. The poor man was so cold that he was shaking. He tried to keep warm by rubbing his hands. He moved up and down the garden path surrounding the lake. Nothing helped. Amkar hugged himself tight and looked at the sky. Even the moon was reluctant to watch him suffer. It hid behind the clouds. It was dark except for the light that flickered on the palace tower. Amkar fixed his sight on that lamp. He imagined the flickering flame to be a raging fire. He imagined sitting before the fire and warming himself. He imagined roasting corn for his children. As the guards rubbed their hands in the cold, Amkar was smiling. He was lost in his own imagination. He forgot about the cold wind and the mists that fell around him. All he could think about was the flame on top of that tower. Slowly, the moon moved away and let the sun return. At the crack of dawn, the guards took Amkar to the kitchen and gave him a warm drink and a blanket. Soon it was time to go to the court. Amkar was confident that the king would give him a job and his family's suffering would be over. He was smiling even though he was still shaking from the cold. The courtiers had gathered early. Prince Vera and Suku had taken their places too. Everyone eagerly awaited the king's arrival. Raja Apurva was surprised to see Amkar in the court. "So you didn't run away?" asked the king. "Why would I?" Maharaj asked Amkar. "I need the job." "Did he have help to keep warm?" the king asked the guard. "No, sir," said the guard. "He stood there all night in his dhoti with a smile on his face." "Why were you smiling?" asked Raja Apurva. "I was gazing at the tower lamp, your majesty," said Amkar, "and imagined it to be a raging fire. In my imagination, I was happily roasting corn in the fire for my children." "Aha!" said Raja Apurva. "You had help. You were warmed by the tower lamp. You didn't complete this challenge as per the conditions I set out." Amkar was stunned. How could the tower lamp keep him warm? It was so far away. King Bhima bristled with anger. He had assigned this case to his uncle and couldn't interfere without insulting him, but it troubled him that one of his own citizens was not getting a fair hearing in his court. Prince Vera and Suku, too, were outraged. How could Raja Apurva treat this man with such callousness? Who ever heard of a lamp so far up in the tower warming a man by the lake? They had to do something. King Bhima shook his head slightly, warning them not to challenge Raja Apurva. Amkar was sent away from the court with nothing. King Bhima retired to his chambers, sullen and angry. As soon as the court was adjourned, the boys left the palace too. "What about Amkar?" said Suku. "I'm sure father will help him after granduncle has gone," said Vera. "But we have to show Raja Apurva that this is not fair," said Suku. "We cannot let him leave without a lesson." "I agree," said Prince Vera. "I've been thinking the same thing." That afternoon, King Bhima didn't want to see Raja Apurva. He wanted to eat with the boys. But the guards told him that Prince Vera was having lunch at Suku's house. Raja Apurva, too, was on his own. He gloated to his guards that he had saved himself a bundle of money because Amkar was a cheat. He was proud of his judgment and proud that Prince Vera had learned a lesson in running court. It was the final evening of Raja Apurva's visit. The kings met in the garden for a stroll. "Where is Vera?" asked King Bhima. "He hasn't returned from Suku's house, your majesty," said the guard. "Why don't we go for a ride, uncle?" asked King Bhima. "Vera must say goodbye to you." "Why don't you summon him here?" asked Raja Apurva. "I thought you might like to see the city at night." Raja Apurva agreed, and the king set off towards Suku's house. As they dismounted their horses, Suku's father came out to greet them. "Welcome, your highnesses," he said. "I welcome both of you." "Where is Vera?" asked King Bhima. "I want to see him right now." "He's been cooking lunch all day, your majesty," said Suku's father. "Cooking all day?" asked Raja Apurva. "It's almost nightfall now. What food is so special that it must cook all day?" "He's just cooking rice, your majesty," said Suku's father. "Do come in." The kings were curious. Why was Prince Vera cooking in Suku's house when a big pot of rice was always ready in the royal kitchens? When they entered the kitchen, Raja Apurva burst out laughing. The stove was lit on the floor. A pot hung from the ceiling far away from the heat. "What are you doing, dear prince?" asked Raja Apurva. "Surely you know how to cook rice. If not, do not come to my palace. No, do come to my palace and I will teach you personally." "But I've learned this from you," said Prince Veera, and Suku giggled. Raja Apurva wasn't smiling, however. "What do you mean?" he demanded. "You're a great monarch, your majesty," said Prince Veera. "For you, even a tower lamp would warm a man by the lakeside. But I'm just a prince. I thought the blazing fire in the stove would heat the pot hanging just above it. That's not too much to ask, is it?" King Bhima chuckled. Raja Apurva understood the prince's subtle message. The lamp in the tower was indeed too far away to warm a man by the lakeside. Amkar wasn't trying to cheat him. The poor man was desperate, and he had been turned away. "You are very wise," said Raja Apurva. "I'm humbled by the lesson you've taught me. I was wrong to dismiss Amkar for imagining the warmth of a lamp." King Bhima hugged Prince Veera and Suku. "I'm proud of you both," he said. "I was so troubled by the judgment all day. You have indeed brought me joy." That night, Raja Apurva summoned Amkar and his family. They were all fed and clothed and asked to accompany the king back to his kingdom. Amkar was given a job at Raja Apurva's palace. Amkar and his family would never go hungry again. "I bid you farewell, King Bhima," said Raja Apurva. "You must bring your son and his friend to my palace next summer." "As long as we don't have to count crows or cook rice," said Prince Veera, "we'd be delighted."